Y las moriscas.
Hello, and welcome to Islam in the Middle Ages, a new series for IHSHG, examining the Islamic world from the Prophet Muhammad to the Mughal Empire on the first Sunday of each month. In this podcast, I hope to offer an accessible and detailed overview of Islamic history for all abilities, whether you're new to the field or a seasoned expert, and to help to bring to a wider audience a fascinating area of history that still remains fairly obscure to most people. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of the IHSHG, and I would like to thank them for giving me the platform to be able to host this. Two special thanks in particular go to João Viegas, the president, for contacting me and giving me the opportunity to be able to do this, and Manuel Conudo, who designed the flyer for this podcast. Do be sure to check out their websites, Facebook page, and YouTube channels for more historical discussions in English and Portuguese. In this first episode, we will explore the very first chapters of the history of Islam, how a new religion in an obscure part of the early medieval world rose to prominence to become a regional superpower. The achievements of this new faith cannot be overstated. In less than 40 years of its conception, this new power took on and defeated the two great empires of the time, and established a lasting legacy in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia that continues to shape the culture, religion, and politics of these regions right through to the modern day. We will examine the Middle East prior to the rise of the Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet's ministry in the early Islamic community, its initial military conquests and what made them so successful, and finally the devastating First Fitnah, or civil war, that shattered the Islamic world with a split that continues even into the modern day. Before I begin, however, I would like to make a quick note on dates. In the PowerPoint visual aid, which you'll be able to find on the IHSHG's website after the episode goes live, I will use both the Christian and Islamic calendar to be able to record dates. The Islamic calendar has 12 lunar months, for those who don't know, making each year slightly shorter than the Christian one, and starts in the year 622, from the time of the Prophet Muhammad's hijrah, or flight from Mecca. For simplicity's sake, when speaking, I will use the conventional Common Era dates that I imagine most listeners will probably be more familiar with. So without further ado, we begin in the 7th century, where, prior to the rise of Islam, the Middle East served as a nexus between the two major world powers of the day, the Byzantine and Persian empires. The Byzantine Empire was what survived of ancient Rome after its collapse in 457, and encompassed areas of the world such as the Balkans, Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, and northern Africa. It was a diverse and multi-ethnic empire, centered around major cities that were hubs of trade and commerce, and ruled by an elite with a shared Christian faith, as well as classical Greek and Roman learning with a distinct Christian spin to it. Although its western counterpart collapsed over 150 years ago, this part of the empire was continuing to thrive economically and politically, taking in further regions and challenging its main rival in the form of the Sasanian dynasty that ruled Persia. Byzantium, however, was not without its issues. The church for some years now had been divided over serious theological issues relating to its creed of faith, and splinter sects that challenged the Byzantine church's supremacy came to settle in the Middle East, where they were less likely to be affected by persecutions from the elite. The empire was also threatened from several different powers across its boundaries, such as barbarian groups in Italy and the Balkans, Berbers from northern Africa, and raiding parties from Central Asia. For this surviving fragment of the glory of ancient Rome, this was certainly both an exciting and indeed terrifying time to be alive. Many parallels from Byzantium can be seen in their rival, that of Persia ruled by the Sasanian dynasty. This empire stretched over a vast swath of Central Asia and was, like Byzantium, a multi-ethnic empire, centered on cities and ruled by an elite that had a shared culture, blending traditional ancient Persian ideas with the Zoroastrian faith. Like Byzantium, a number of religious minorities existed here, such as Christians, Jews, and pagans. Although unlike Byzantium, they were treated with a little more tolerance. Indeed, the Persian capital of Ctesiphon became the centre of pagan learning and philosophy after this kind of scholarship was shut down in Byzantine-ruled Greece. Persia, however, had threats from both within and abroad. At the start of the 7th century, the ruling class was suffering from increasingly crippling bouts of infighting, and invaders from beyond its borders also started to threaten the empire. It may interest the listener to know that some of the first armoured cavaliers in medieval history came from this part of the world in the form of the Persian cataphracts that were deployed to fight steppe-dwelling invaders from Central Asia that generally challenged the Persian way of life, much in the same way as the Huns or the Xiongnu from Han China. Throughout Persian literature, this divide between settled agricultural plains and the wild, untamed steppes was a prominent theme, given the regular challenge it posed to the survivability of the Persian state. It's important to note here the comparison that can be drawn between the Byzantine and Persian empires. Both were urban-based polities that ruled over a variety of peoples and religions, supported by an established imperial structure and ruled by an elite with a shared culture and faith. This is important as it's this infrastructure and framework that the Arabs would inherit and take over during their conquests, and they would then be able to turn into their own systems of government. The Middle East was therefore a meeting point between these two empires, and being just outside of the borders of either, this was a place where ideas and trade could flow fairly freely, and, as we have seen, religious minorities and non-conformist ideas could thrive. The Arabs who inhabited the peninsula just south of the Levant existed as a mixture of settled pastoralists in oasis towns, as well as nomads or Bedouins in the desert. They were organized into a number of distinct tribes that had a variety of shared points of culture, such as a common language that produced a rich tradition of romantic poetry, as well as laws to keep peace between one another, over subjects such as marriage and honor. Although the early Arabs were polytheist for the most part, Christianity and Judaism had begun to take root in the peninsula from the 4th century onwards. The kingdom of Himyar in present-day Yemen, for example, was believed to be ruled by a Jewish dynasty. Arab tribes were both trading partners and political clients to Byzantium and Persia, and they were, to a lesser extent, involved in the politics of both states. The Ghassanid and Lakhmid tribes, for example, fought in some of the 6th century border wars for Byzantium and Persia, respectively. Although this was a world therefore dominated by the Byzantine and Persian imperial forces, this was about to rapidly change. From the 540s onwards, both of these empires had become involved in an intermittent series of wars, which began to take a serious toll on both of their military capacities. The most devastating of these wars ended in 622, just as the Islamic faith was beginning to take root in the Arab Peninsula. At this time, further issues were also beginning to develop. In Syria, for example, regions started to suffer economic downturn, as well as sporadic outbursts of bubonic plague, which destabilized Byzantine influence over the region, which already was fairly fragile, given that they had just wrangled it from Persian forces beforehand. This, and many other regions, were beginning to feel the strain of these empires creaking as their militaries suffered to keep up with the pace of one another. Albert Harani and Chris Frickham suggests that, in response to this may have even stimulated a renewed interest in the destiny of mankind in religious and intellectual circles, and even a questioning of whether or not the coming of the end times was imminent, an important concept in the worldview of Christianity, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism. My own interpretation is that these are at the very least the conditions that we tend to expect new religions and ideas to be able to thrive and do rather well in, and conditions that new faiths can very easily spread. And it's at this point that I will talk about the Prophet Muhammad and the establishment of the Islamic faith. In 610, Muhammad, a merchant from the Quraysh tribe, born in 570, received what he believed to be a revelation from the angel Gabriel, offering him a radical reinterpretation of Jewish and Christian scripture. At the heart of Muhammad's message was that his was the final and most complete revelation from God, in a line of prophets that went back through the ages all the way to the time of Adam himself. Muhammad preached that the day of judgment was imminent, and the way to earn one's place in Jannah, or paradise, was to repent from one's old ways and to live a life of modesty, piety, and generosity. As the Prophet Muhammad's teachings began to crystallize, 5 distinct tenets began to emerge to distinguish those who practiced the faith. First, a creed, that there was no God but God and Muhammad was the messenger of God. And secondly, a series of ritual prayers that could be performed in private but preferably would be performed communally. This began as praying 2 times a day and was eventually extended up to 5. The faithful were also expected to give their income to those in need, to fast during the month of Ramadan, and if at all possible, to make pilgrimage to the Holy Kaaba shrine in Mecca. The new faith also called for a high degree of communal solidarity, praying and studying together, and for Muslims to look after their fellow Muslims. Muhammad's ideas were initially orally taught and disseminated between the early Islamic community, and then were later recorded on loose pieces of parchment, stone, and palm leaves. Sometime between the 640s and 670s, complete accounts of the full revelation began to be ordered into books, beginning with an opening prayer and organized into chapters arranged in orders of length. This document came to be known as the Quran, the holy and revealed text of the faith. Being the word of God transmitted, it is likely that this text received very little initial editing, beyond its first arrangements. When the very first editions of this text came about, however, is unclear. Although we know the approximate dates, the specific times that the first Qurans were created is lost to us. There have been several attempts to date back the earliest Quranic manuscripts, but to little avail. The Birmingham Quran, a fragment of early scripture now residing in the university that it was named after, attracted some attention in 2015 with an unusually early carbon date. Although due to the broad range of dating available, spanning from 548 to 645, the exact time it was compiled continues to be unclear. This new faith gained a sizable community of early converts. However, it proved controversial among the people of Muhammad's hometown of Mecca, and even his own family. The growing hostility to his ideas that emerged eventually forced him to flee in 622 to the town of Yathrib, several hundred miles north, an event known as the Hijrah that began the Islamic calendar. From this point onwards, the idea began to emerge that it would be necessary to fight to stop the new faith from being extinguished altogether. After converting some of the Arab tribes in Yathrib, which would later be given the name Medina, Muhammad returned to Mecca with an army to cement the place of Islam within the city, and to purge the Kaaba shrine of idols, which Muhammad taught was built by Abraham and Ishmael as a shrine to the one true God. It is interesting, as a side note, to look at Muhammad's personal connection to the Kaaba, as the shrine had, in the days of pagan worship, been guarded by the Quraysh tribe that Muhammad himself had hailed from. In 632, the Prophet Muhammad died, and leadership of the Islamic community fell to one of his followers, Abu Bakr, who was designated as the first of 3 subsequent caliphs, or deputies. This, however, was not without some controversy, and the position of Abu Bakr inherited was contested on some levels. First and foremost, the exact responsibilities of the Caliph were uncertain. He was certainly there to lead, guide, and arbitrate between the community of the rightly guided, although how close he was to the divine and what role he had in interpreting the laws set down by the Quran were nebulous. Unlike the Prophet, the Caliph had no direct connection to divinity, although they did carry significant authority in their leadership and judgment, at least initially. The credentials of succession were also up for dispute. Should the Caliph be a member of the early believers, the companions of the Prophet that were with him during his first days of ministry, or his family? Or did it suffice for him to simply be a good leader and a pious Muslim? Furthermore, Who is invested to decide these matters? These issues, although seemingly settled for now, will later have significant consequences for the early Islamic community. I'm going to pause the narrative here and say that this is the conventional account of the early days of Islam, and one that most historians of this period use as it allows us to understand Islam's early history through the eyes of those who did, and continue to, believe in it. It is worth mentioning, however, that our knowledge of the actual facts of this period, and the years up until the 8th century, is hindered by the source material that we have available to us, or indeed, lack thereof. The sources describing this period are fragmentary and, in many cases, written with a distinct agenda in mind, making it difficult to differentiate hard facts from interpretation of the author. The most comprehensive of these sources are secondary accounts, written by scholars in the 9th century. These offer by far the most detailed accounts of the period, but many of these were written in a period of acute political and religious tension. Many of these sources are designed to interpret early history through the eyes of the factions that scholars were paid to write for, making it hard to be able to establish the line between verifiable fact and interpretation. The remedy to this is often to cross-reference sources with other pieces of evidence from the period. However, this too is hindered by the fact that many of the accounts disagree on significant details, and other evidence available to us is fragmentary, comprising of things such as Arabic graffiti with distinctly Islamic phrases that we can date back to rough decades, as well as external documents such as Syriac Christian accounts of the early community, and agreements between the early community and the Jews of Medina in 627. Without significant details, it is hard to be able to establish a cogent narrative rooted in empirical evidence, and it's important to bear that in mind when examining this period. Nevertheless, as previously stated, the conventional account does at least allow us to understand how the Islamic world's history, present, and future is viewed on its own terms. So it is this account that we will be using going ahead. At the same time as a new leader was being chosen, conquests began to take place. By the 630s, the entire peninsula had been united, and the once divided Arab tribes were now brought together in a faith that preached brotherhood and solidarity amongst fellow believers. That's not to say that tensions were entirely erased, but a new unifying framework was now in place to at least mitigate these tensions in the short term. The new caliphate, under the leadership of the Caliph, then fought the Byzantine Empire in the Middle East, defeating them at the Battle of Yarmouk and conquering Byzantine-ruled areas of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. For Byzantium, this was crippling. They had lost nearly 2/3 of their land and some of their wealthiest holdings. Egypt, for example, was a major source of grain as well as gold coins to the empire. Faced with these losses, Byzantium would retreat into itself and reorganize in anticipation of further threat, resembling less and less the empire that it had grown out of. Their rivals in Persia fared much worse. By the 640s, the Caliphate began to fight and push back the Persian Empire and establish a presence in Iraq and Iran. A decade later, the Sasanian dynasty fell, and Persia would be without a Shah for nearly a millennium until the rise of the Safavids in 1501. It is hard to overstate how impressive these early conquests were. In just a few decades, the Arabs were able to defeat the two great powers of the region and establish a sizable and rich land holding for themselves. Given that just a few decades ago, this part of the world had been seen as a frontier state, full of many minor areas of influence, this is all the more remarkable. The speed and efficiency of these conquests can be likened to other great powers, such as Alexander and the Mongols, but unlike them was much more long-lasting. And so this certainly deserves a more detailed examination for why they were as successful as they were. When Arab armies conquered new regions, they tended to take over major centers of power and then, setting themselves up in a military encampment, exacted tribute, while allowing the conquered area to continue largely as it had before. Many of the military encampments that Arabs ruled from, as time went on, would later develop more permanent structures, such as mosques, Quranic schools, and markets. and would attract waves of settlers into the region. Having served as clients to the two empires previously, the Arabs were able to field small, effective, well-organized armies, united with a common, divinely led mission to expand the territories of Islam as far as possible, that were able to rapidly overtake the depleted forces of Byzantium and Persia. Each conquest came with a tax system that had been set up by the empire that had formerly ruled it, giving the Arabs a revenue stream that allowed them to fight further conquests and give increasing momentum to their campaigns, rather like how modern investors will place money from stocks into even more valuable investments to keep growing their income. It's also noteworthy that major splits in the early caliphate would only emerge after they had conquered a sizable portion of their landholdings, making it hard for their enemies to exploit divisions that may have otherwise weakened the ascendant power. Finally, unlike many other rapidly conquering powers, such as the barbarian tribes that took over Europe after the collapse of Rome, and the Mongols in Central Asia, the Arabs came with a distinct language, culture, and faith that was already established, meaning that instead of assimilating to the faith and culture of the people that they conquered, they were able to maintain a distinct culture of the ruling class that would spread to wider society. This partly explains why Islamic culture has survived for so long in these regions, whilst other comparable conquerors had much more short-lived impact on the regions that they managed to take over. At this stage, though, there was very little attempt to try to change the status quo within these provinces, or to try to bring about conversion to the faith or utilization of the Arabic language. This would come later, in the late 7th and early 8th centuries, as the Arabs became more established in these regions. As such, these conquests were likely to have had little disruption on the lives of the peoples that had once lived there. It's worth remembering that, in this period, the majority of individuals in these regions would have been rural peasants who would have had little interaction with the ruling elite outside of local governors, armies, and tax collectors. Therefore, a change in management at the top would probably have meant little to the individuals whose world extended to only their local village and some of the surrounding area. After the 650s, these conquests continued, taking over northern Africa, Iberia, Central Asia, and India. In 750, the Arab armies even fought their third major world empire, in the form of the Tang Chinese, at the Battle of Talas, near modern Kyrgyzstan on the Chinese border. This was another decisive Arab victory, aided by their Tibetan allies, and halted the expansion of the ebullient Tang Empire, which even resulted in an attempted military coup against the emperor in its aftermath. Talas is also the event attributed to the establishment of paper in the Arab world, brought, so the story goes, by Chinese prisoners of war to the caliphate's capital, which by then had become the Iraqi city of Baghdad. There's no evidence to suggest that this story was real, unfortunately, but it's a good tale, nevertheless. Therefore, by the 650s, the Arabs had rapidly established themselves as a serious power within the region, and were in a very strong position. However, what would follow would be a devastating split in the community of the rightly guided, and this was a split that continues to resonate into the modern period. We therefore come to perhaps the most controversial part of the early history, the First Fitnah, and the establishment of the Sunni-Shia divide. I should stress that this is a very general overview of the events that unfold, which are very complicated, and whilst I have done my best to keep this as neutral as I can, I do apologise if I misinterpret or miss out any key details, or if any of you listening feel that I've interpreted any event in an unfair light. The roots of this issue go back to the question of succession after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. The three caliphs that succeeded Muhammad, which would later become known as the Rashdun Caliphs, were not accepted by every member of the community. Some believed that the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law Ali should have succeeded him instead, and that these three caliphs usurped his rightful leadership. This was a tension that stayed relatively calm for the early period, but came to a fall towards the end of our period in 656, when the third Rashdun Caliph, Uthman I, was murdered in his own palace. The cause of his death was unclear, and there are several interpretations to explain it. It may have been rivals in his own clan, were even amongst the early companions of the Prophet that were dissatisfied with his style of rule. Uthman had, unfortunately, a tendency to promote members of his own tribe into positions of power, isolating prominent members of the Islamic community who hoped to have a stake in the caliphate. Other sources draw attention to the elements of dissatisfied Egyptian soldiers in the armies of the caliphate, who may have been annoyed at the heavy tribute of grain levied from the distant caliph based in Medina. Some blamed Ali, believing that he orchestrated the assassination to take the place as the true leader of the community. The exact reason for Uthman's death is unclear, but it is the latter interpretation that was taken up by the governor of Syria and Uthman's relative, Muawiyah. Taking up arms against Ali, who had recently been proclaimed caliph in Basra in southern Iraq, Muawiyah did the unthinkable and opened up civil war within the community of the rightly guided. This event, known as the First Fitnah, was the first major instance of Muslims fighting one another. After the Battle of Siffin in 657, Ali stood down and conceded the caliphate to Muawiyah. Some of his followers accepted his decision, whereas others broke away, believing that humans were arbitrating over an issue that should be decided by God and God alone. Those that rejected the settlement of Siffin would later go on to form the Abadi and Khariji sects of Islam that accepts the interpretations of neither of the two major sects of Sunnism or Shia Islam. A second serious blow to the unity of the community occurred, however, in 661, when a Khariji assassin murdered Ali, creating around him a number of followers that sought to put right what they believed to be this injustice inflicted. I'll now take some time to explore in a little more depth Shia Islam and its various strands and what it came to represent. The Shiite sect that emerged from the supporters of Ali after his death did and still does continue to believe that the Rashidun Caliphs, the first three that came after Muhammad, were not the true leaders of the early community, and Ali was always supposed to be the one who succeeded Muhammad. Ali and his successors are given the title of Imam, as an honorific sort of title to them. As time went on, the belief began to develop that the true leader of the community, the rightly guided, was in hiding, and set to emerge prior to the Day of Judgment. This belief in turn eventually divided into two major schools, the Ismailis and the Twelvers, and for those following the PowerPoint, I've included a diagram here to be able to explain the splits a little better, as it can be a little complicated if you're just following my voice and nothing else. The two sects that Shia Islam divided into were the Twelvers and the Ismailis. Broadly speaking, they're certainly the two largest sects. The Ismailis believe that the last legitimate Imam, or true leader, died in 874, and that no more legitimate Imams existed after that. Although this belief was slightly modified in 10th century Egypt, when a rival Shiite caliphate was established against the caliphate that was then in Baghdad. And the first caliph there claimed to be the 8th Imam in turn. The Twelvers, by contrast, believe that after the 12th Imam, the true leader of the community entered into hiding, or gheba, and is still waiting for the best time to return. The early Shiites as a whole had varying degrees of resistance to the caliphates that emerged, that ranged from open rebellion to more tacit forms of resistance. By the 8th century, however, the first Shiite powers began to emerge in the Islamic world, starting with minor dynasties such as the Idrisids in Morocco and the Boyyids in northern Iran. Then, in the early 10th century, the first major Shiite power emerged in the form of the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt. For the majority of the Islamic world, however, Muawiyah became caliph in 661, establishing a dynasty that would last for the next century and oversee the consolidation of Islamic belief, law, and practice into the territories that it had conquered. In the next episode of Islam in the Middle Ages, we will explore the Umayyads, this dynasty of caliphs that Muawiyah established, as well as the ways that Islamic society began to crystallize. We will examine the developments of religion, law, and culture, and the way that power began to shift from the caliph to the scholars that interpreted both the Quran as well as the words and deeds of the Prophet, or Hadith. This therefore concludes our first episode of Islam in the Middle Ages, and I include finally in the PowerPoint a few references to the images used. Thank you very much for listening, and we shall see you in the next episode.